там люди есть?
Да, поднимай наш состав.
Поднимаю, начальника поднял.
On April 26, 1986, a catastrophe shook the whole of Europe. And the world would experience a fatal day that became engraved in its history. A catastrophe that would turn an entire city into a post-apocalyptic ghost town. A disaster that revealed the true devastating nature of nuclear energy in the wrong hands. This is the tragedy of Chernobyl and the damages it left behind after a deadly fight against an invisible enemy. This appears to be pristine wilderness, a world full of life. A quiet area where nature and wildlife is thriving. This could be paradise on Earth. But it has a dreadful secret. Ukraine, 1986. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant was one of the Soviet Union's largest nuclear power plants. Located 60 miles north of Ukraine's capital city of Kiev and near the border of Belarus. Chernobyl was about 9 miles away and home to about 12,000 residents. Closer to the plant, only 2 miles away from the reactors, the city of Pripyat was built in 1970 as a home for the plant workers. This new city had high quality and modern high-rise buildings. Pripyat housed almost 50,000 people. It was lively and rich, full of talents, and goods were more available there than in any other parts of the Union. Pripyat was the perfect execution of Soviet planning and ideology. It seemed to be promising. But its future wouldn't be the bright one that had been predicted. In the spring of 1986, its fate was sealed. Inside the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, there were RBMK-1000 type reactors. They would be proven to be highly dangerous due to having a design flaw. According to the workers, reactor number 4 was the best of all. It turned out they couldn't have been more wrong. On 26th of April, 1986, at 1:23 a.m., a catastrophe shook the whole of Europe. And the world would experience a fatal day that became engraved in its history. A major nuclear accident. One of the worst man-made disasters of all time. The largest nuclear catastrophe to this day.
Поднимай на состав.
Поднимаю, начальника поднял.
Так всех, весь офицерский состав, офицерский корпус поднимай.
Пожарная охрана. Алло, Иванков. Да-да. Значит, вы выезжаете в Припять? Алло. Да-да, я слышу. На атомную станцию выезжаете. Там 204-й блок горит крыша.
The amount of radiation was 400 times higher than what was released by the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs in 1945. A radioactive cloud spread over the entire European continent. On that night, a routine safety check went horribly wrong. The reactor 4 exploded, ripping the 1,000-ton roof off in the process. The power plant was shaken by 2 enormous explosions. During the test, inadequately trained personnel made fatal mistakes and violated safety protocols. Despite attempts to shut down the reactor entirely, a power surge caused a chain reaction of explosions inside. Finally, the nuclear core itself was exposed, causing a nuclear meltdown, spewing radioactive dust into the atmosphere. In the springtime of 1986, where flowers were supposed to bloom and nature come back to life. A whole ecosystem was disturbed, broken. From then on, a relentless fight against an invisible enemy began, putting thousands of lives on the line. The incident would turn out to be a milestone in the history of nuclear power and the catalyst of the collapse of the Soviet Union as they tried to cover it up. The people became disillusioned with the Soviet ideology. The station immediately became unsuitable for human life, and this disaster will haunt its inhabitants and have repercussions on the country for thousands of years. The explosions immediately killed 2 workers. They were the first to die within hours of the accident. More than 100 were injured. The first firemen to arrive at the scene battled the fire heroically, and without any adequate protective equipment, unaware of the radiation seeping into the atmosphere. They poured tons of water on this strange fire, but nothing seemed to be putting it out. Some began to lose consciousness. Others started vomiting. At least 5% of the radioactive reactor core was released into the atmosphere. People were urgently rushed to the nearby hospitals, and all the contaminated clothes, footwear, and bed linen were thrown away. Over the next coming weeks, on a total of 134 servicemen that were injured, 28 firefighters and plant workers would die from acute radiation syndrome. Many more contracted serious illness. They were the first victims of Chernobyl. For the next several days, emergency crews desperately tried to contain the fire and radiation leaks. The death toll kept climbing. The fire was still burning. On the 3rd day, 80 helicopters were sent from Moscow to put the fire out. When they arrived, the temperature made it impossible to get close. From the air, soldiers threw out 80 kilograms of sandbags into the blaze with their bare hands to fill up the reactors and smother the fire. In 2 days, 2,400 tons of lead would also be dropped into the reactor. After a few missions, soldiers would start throwing up. It was heroism. It had to be done. There was no better solution. During this operation, 600 pilots were contaminated with radiation. There was despair and hopelessness as the situation seemed impossible to deal with. Flying around in helicopters wasn't enough. They needed to get closer and down into the core. But how? Something had to be done to keep the magma from melting down. They came up with a solution, but it would cause the loss of more lives. They built a 550-foot-long tunnel below the reactor. The fire took 10 days and 250 firefighters to extinguish it. However, toxic emissions continued to escape into the atmosphere. Later on, the crews discovered something horrific: the most toxic mass on Earth. A solid, large radioactive mass of melted nuclear fuel, metal and concrete, located beneath the destroyed Reactor 4. The radiation readers made it clear that what was inside was something to be avoided. They called it the elephant's foot. Scientists believe that it is going to emit radiation for many centuries to come. In a month, 10,000 miners would be sent to work there, facing extremely dangerous conditions. A total of 600,000 rescuers, including firefighters, pilots, miners, and local volunteers, were sent from all over the Union to fight against this terrifying invisible enemy and to clean up the disaster. These people would be called the liquidators. These men and women who fought a ruthless battle have now become almost forgotten heroes. Yet it is thanks to them that the worst was avoided. At the Kremlin in Moscow, 8 hours after the disaster, Mikhail Gorbachev, leader of the Soviet Union, received very limited information on the situation. The first information consisted of accident and fire, but no word about an explosion. The reaction of the Soviet government was controversial. For years, the secretive state tried to cover up what really happened. At first, they ordered a complete media blackout, only to avoid panic, they claimed. The less knowledge and the more silence, the better. But frightening gossips were already going around the city. The situation was underestimated. No one really knew the scope of the accident. Even doctors were strictly instructed not to tell the patients that something was wrong, and that they would lose their jobs if they said anything opposite. A few days after the accident, and despite alarming radiation levels, authorities still encouraged people to participate in May Day celebrations, even in areas they knew to be seriously contaminated. Disturbingly, all footage of May 1st, 1986 has now disappeared from the Ukrainian National Archives. In Pripyat, by early afternoon the next day, the radiation readings were already 15,000 times higher than usual. By the evening, it had increased even more, creating a lethal dose for the inhabitants. They would die in only 4 days if they stayed. Even on photographs, radiation was visible. But the city's communication was cut and all roads were blocked to make sure no information left the municipality. Unaware of the disaster happening only 3 kilometers away, people continued to live their normal lives. Children continued to play in the radioactive sand of the amusement parks, while radioactive particles were falling on the grounds. By the evening of April 26th, windows and doors should have been sealed and iodide tablets swallowed. But such an order had not been given. The government only started distributing iodide 10 days after the explosion. Wrong doses were also administered to children. By that point, it was useless. Iodide can protect from thyroid cancer only if it's given in the right time, a maximum of 18 hours after exposure.
In Chernobyl, the population was not moved. The contaminated foodstuffs were kept within the food chain for a critical period, and iodine tablets weren't handed out to protect the thyroid from thyroid cancer.
It was chaos. Nobody had any training in radiation. At Kiev's National Medical Library, the librarians even received an order to take all the books from the shelves that contained the word radiation. The disaster was expanding. No one in the surrounding areas was evacuated until about 36 hours after the disaster began. By that time, many residents were already complaining about headaches, vomiting, and other early signs of radiation sickness. It was terrifying. But the situation turned critical. The evacuations of Pripyat commenced on the next day, on April 27th. The people living around Chernobyl were finally notified about the accident. But authorities falsely stated that they had it under control and that the evacuation was only temporary. Only the most necessary belongings were needed. Personal documents and some food, they were told. In a matter of a few hours, people had to leave their homes, their entire lives behind. They were told that they were leaving for 3 days only. They would never come back. The evacuation was a massive operation. 49,000 people were forced to flee in under 4 hours. Officials finally closed off the area by May 14th, establishing an exclusion zone around the reactor and evacuating another 116,000 residents. But it was too late. The damage was done.
Somebody at the top has to decide what's going to happen. But what I don't think will happen is that they will suddenly, as it were, come clean and become very open, allow international inspection and so on. What is much more likely to happen is that in the course of time, new information will be released in dribs and drabs. But this will come out as they see fit. They're not going to suddenly open the doors to people to go in to see what's happened, and I don't think that they're going to accept international aid either.
People were moved to other regions in Ukraine, and most of the power plant workers were sent to Kiev. In total, some 350,000 people were evacuated. No news about Chernobyl surfaced until the next days in the rest of the Soviet Union. In fact, the citizens only found out about the catastrophe via foreign communication channels. The Soviet media channels kept quiet until Sweden was the first country to detect that something disastrous had happened. This forced the Soviet government to come out. Such a massive disaster was impossible to hide for long. Radiation spread quickly around Europe, immediately affecting Scandinavian countries. It was only on the 14th of May, after the 1st of May celebrations, and 3 weeks after the accident, that Gorbachev decided to make a public announcement on TV.
Today on Soviet television, Mr. Gorbachev said the accident has deeply affected the Soviet people and, as he put it, disturbed world opinion. He told his fellow countrymen that the worst is now behind them. It has certainly taken Mr. Gorbachev a long time to go public.
Добрый вечер, товарищи. We were recently stricken by a disaster, the Chernobyl nuclear power accident. It deeply affected the Soviet people and disturbed world opinion.
The news finally reached the entire country.
The White House says Mr. Reagan's attempts to discuss the situation with Mr. Gorbachev personally have been ignored by the Kremlin for 4 days.
Not very much.
They're usually a little close-mouthed about things, and we've been no exception.
We don't think that they have provided as full and prompt information as they should have. Our own pictures give us information that suggests the casualty rates are higher than those that have been announced by the Soviet Union so far, by a good measure.
As the crisis continued, more economic, technical, and scientific forces were mobilized. It was a frontline emergency situation. The radioactive cloud continued to drift over Europe. It soon reached the United Kingdom, France, and Italy. The French authorities denied its presence. In Chernobyl, the radioactivity continued to climb. Millions of acres of forest and farmland were contaminated, and although many people were evacuated, hundreds of thousands more remained. Animals were also highly contaminated and left abandoned. Nobody took care of them. Their owners wouldn't return. Special hunting squads were formed, killing cats, dogs, and all other animals, because of the fear that they would keep spreading the radiation. Soon, but unfortunately not soon enough, the entire world realized that it was witnessing a historic event. "34 years after the disaster, the area of Chernobyl remains uninhabitable and abandoned. Although Pripyat is safe enough for a brief visit, the cleanup was a massive operation. It took years and involved hundreds of thousands of people. Today, surprisingly, there are still about 120 people who self-settled and are still living in the exclusion zone. Around 8 million people live in the contaminated areas of the Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. For all these years, they've been living on contaminated land and radioactive food. This is an issue that has been systematically ignored.
It takes afterwards a very long time to decontaminate. You know that one test in the bikini, which happened many years ago, or 30 years ago, it took years before the people could go back there. And even now they're not allowed to eat the food grown there. So it may take years and years before it goes back to normal.
The consequences are still felt nowadays. Among humans, radiation-induced illnesses and cancer deaths were expected in the long term, including thyroid cancer, birth defects, mutations, and deformations, intellectual and physical disabilities, and overall pain and suffering. Livestock and wildlife were also highly affected. In West Germany, Down syndrome peaked for 9 months in '87. The United Nations Scientific Committee reported that more than 6,000 children developed thyroid cancer after being exposed to radiation. Although some experts have recently claimed that there is no evidence of a major public health impact attributable to radiation exposure 20 years after the accident.
The Princess of Wales had asked to visit these children. They're all suffering from diseases which can't be treated effectively in the Soviet Union. 3, like 4-year-old Marcel, have cancers which appear to be connected with the Chernobyl disaster. The liquidators were incapable of going back to a normal life. They were all victims of the Chernobyl syndrome. The ones who survived were disabled or unable to work.
You know, even robots couldn't work on top of those buildings because of the radiation. And so they sent people. It was so dangerous the men never stayed more than 20 to 40 seconds up there. Otherwise they'd get completely irradiated.
Anatoly Vinokur used to work as a hospital attendant in the area. He was sent to the site just minutes after the explosion.
The doctors found radiation burns on my face, in my thoracic cage and in my throat. I could hardly eat. And through my window, all day long, I saw a car that drove big black bags straight to the cemetery.
Today, Anatoly suffers from a dozen illnesses, all as a result of the exposure to the radiation. And with a small pension to live on, he struggles to cope with the medication expenses. The association Soyuz Chernobyl offers financial support to victims like Anatoly. Its president says that many of them have the impression they have been forgotten.
Medical help to the people of Chernobyl has shrunk 8-fold. Today it's only 6 million hryvnias. That's equivalent to 20 euro cents per person per year. The Ukrainian government has no respect.
According to the military, out of the 600,000 liquidators, 10% have died, and 200,000 are disabled. The real amount of radiation these people are exposed to has never been revealed to them. There were a lot of lies, and only a few realized the scope of these lies. On the second anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster, on the 27th of April, 1988, Valery Legasov, the chief of the commission investigating it, and who had worked so hard to unveil the truth, decided to end his life. He had recorded and hidden the tapes blaming engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, who was in charge of the safety test that resulted in the disaster, and other superiors for the incident.
We are going to talk this afternoon about the impact of Chernobyl. Something of the order of 40 or 45 deaths might be expected in all subsequent years as a result of this accident.
To this day, only 59 deaths have been officially recorded and attributed to the disaster. The exact actual human cost of Chernobyl will never really be known. There is little reliable data. The full consequences of the accident, including impacts on health, remain highly debated and under study. Most estimates range from 4,000 to 93,000 deaths. In the first few months following the catastrophe, Pripyat became a conservation reserve. Flowers were planted along the pavements, goods were still in the shops, and even the traffic lights continued to work. But there was no cars and no sign of human life. As time passed, the city became more and more empty and silent. Some old inhabitants illegally climbed back into their own homes to see if they could find the belongings that they'd left behind, only to realize that nothing was there and that it was all over. People came to rob the shops and stole what was left. People still take things from the dead city as souvenir. Pripyat may well be the last place on Earth to conserve a little Soviet Union in its 1980s state. Now, trees and plants have grown in the middle of the roads and are reclaiming the whole town. The flowers are gone. The Soviet apartments are crumbling. The 1st of May parade's posters still decorate the buildings. The amusement park with the bumper cars were never used, and the Ferris wheel that never turned has become an iconic symbol of the disaster. In the areas just outside the exclusion zone, people are beginning to resettle. The deadly disaster of Chernobyl and the ghost town it left behind fascinated many people. Surprisingly, it even became a tourism hotspot. In 2011, Ukraine opened up the area to tourists. The town gives us a glimpse of what a real post-apocalyptic world looks like. Deserted towns, abandoned buildings, overgrown streets, high grass, rusty vehicles, everything crumbling, breaking, and among these, wild animals. It attracts numerous tourists who are interested in its history, in its danger, and in immersing themselves in the past. In fact, the exclusion zone was ranked the most exotic place for tourism in the world by Forbes in 2009. The zone is visited by more than 70,000 people from all around the world every year. This place of tragedy became a legend and is popular among photographers and authors. It is also featured in movies and video games. Even illegal visitors began to sneak into the no-go zone. Hunters and explorers who are looking for an adrenaline rush or hoping to find scary scenes and objects still enter the sites that are strictly prohibited. It is said that the town will fall completely into ruin on its own in the next 20 years. The city that was once so full of life only left eerie memories. The city that once represented hope and triumph represents today destruction and defeat. Pripyat was removed from the maps. It became a dead city. However, today, it seems that nature has started to come back to life again. The impact on the surrounding forest and wildlife also remains an area of active research. In the immediate aftermath of the accident, an area became known as the Red Forest. The high levels of radiation colored the pine trees reddish-brown after absorbing such deadly high levels of radiation. It had to be cut down. The area is still believed to be the most contaminated land on the planet, land that will take thousands of years to become healthy again. Today, the exclusion zone is eerily quiet, but it also appears full of life. Mother Nature began to reclaim this place. The region is filled with a variety of wildlife and forests that have thrived and creeped in without interference from humans. Other wild creatures that the people were so determined to keep out started reappearing. Brown bears were seen for the first time after being absent for over a century. Wolves, deers, lynx, beavers, boars, and elks have been seen to run free in the dense woodlands that now surround the silent power plant. The man-made disaster that ruined this place turned it into a unique sanctuary for wildlife. But despite the dense vegetation, and even though this could appear as pristine wilderness, it is not. It is still a contaminated, deserted wasteland. The area has recovered to some extent, but is far from returning to normal. The animals are still radioactive, yet due to the exclusion of human activity, there are a lot more of them now, and they are ruling the place. This is the bittersweet paradox of this place. 3 decades later, it is not certain how radiation still is and will be affecting wildlife in the years to come. But it seems that nature can triumph, even when man has done its best to destroy it. The Chernobyl power plant continued operating after the accident. More than 10,000 people worked there, and appropriate conditions had to be provided somewhere near the reactors. It took the government about a month to decide what to do with the damaged reactor. On May 20th, 1986, they finally decided to conduct a unique project. It was going to be hidden and sealed. An enormous reinforced concrete and metal structure was built around the damaged Unit 4. The sarcophagus, intended to act as a shield to contain the radiation. The giant structure's construction took 7 months. This was an enormous challenge, where humans could work for only a few minutes at a time without receiving a fatal dose of radiation. In 1988, Soviet scientists revealed that it had only been designed to last for 20 to 30 years. The Chernobyl power plant finally shut down completely in 2000. However, the sarcophagus condition was deteriorating. It began crumbling down and had a high probability of collapsing. The magma at the reactor's core was still a threat. The government had to come up with a replacement. What remains of the reactor is now inside a massive 32,000-ton steel containment structure deployed in 2016. The new safe confinement began being built in 2010 to cover the first sarcophagus. At that point, it became the largest land-based object ever moved by humans, costing $2.3 billion. The area is safer, but still highly radioactive, and will likely remain as such for up to 20,000 years. Both Chernobyl and Fukushima were level 7 nuclear accidents, but the health consequences in Japan were much less severe, in part because there was far more radiation released at Chernobyl, and because the Soviet plant's reactor was not surrounded by any containment structure, so radiation escaped freely. The disaster sparked criticism of the Soviet government. It also fueled a global anti-nuclear movement. Countries combined their efforts to fight against such deadly consequences. Yet today the disaster and its lessons seem to be fading from memory. But it is still a global problem, and it isn't over yet. 11 RBMK nuclear reactors are still in use in the world today. All of them in Russia. Although they were all modified for safety, experts are still researching ways to prevent further nuclear disasters. On contrary to public belief, nuclear energy is still considered the safest energy source in comparison to other fossil fuels like coal, which is by far the most dangerous. But it doesn't come without a risk. Renewable energies are still not talked about enough in Ukraine. Chernobyl also led to an economic fallout. It has been estimated to cost around $235 billion in damages. The politicians were unprepared and unable to effectively handle the aftermath. It undermined faith in the whole system. Gorbachev himself claimed that the accident was perhaps the real cause of the Soviet Union collapse. Chernobyl revealed the potential dangers and the true devastating nature of nuclear energy. Chernobyl is a lesson for the present. It warns us about the challenges and high-consequence risks of our ever-evolving modern society. As technology keeps progressing, it is important that we assess and manage the risks that are big in scale and complexity. We need to be able to anticipate a global catastrophe. Chernobyl was one of the worst man-made and terrifying disasters in history. Tens of thousands of lives were ruined, and too many people lost loved ones because of it. But Chernobyl taught us more importantly about the cost of lies. By highlighting the flaws of the system, it revealed how they can lead to disaster, and how the way we tell information about what really happened can cause harm. If anything has been learned, it is that response to such a disaster needs to be based on clear facts, on science, and not fear. Being transparent in today's society is a necessity, because the truth may be elusive, but consequences certainly won't. We're all part of the same planet, and when a world disaster happens, its countries and their populations deserve to know what is happening in order to avoid what happened at Chernobyl. Proper knowledge, protocol, and equipment is necessary. It is also a grave reminder that we must steer future generations from any risk of another nuclear apocalypse. The past cannot be undone, but we can learn from it. Chernobyl is a grave reminder of the power of nuclear energy in the wrong hands and the consequences of lies.